Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm very excited today to have special guest Denny Burk with me. Denny is the president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. He's a professor of biblical studies at Boyce College, and he's an associate pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. So, Denny, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, so before we dig in, the very first thing I'll say, if you have not done so already, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. You can hit the like too button. I love the like button, but I would love the subscribe button. The other thing I want to say, Denny, you wrote a recent article about kind of complementarianism, gender theology, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a minute, where you address some of the critics of it. And so I was one of the people that you mentioned as having some criticisms of it. So I really appreciate you coming on here, coming into the lion's den. And so we're going to keep this as a very friendly discussion. I want to just say first, I think that your characterization of what I wrote about it as a sociological critique was very accurate. So I think you got it right on that one. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of that stuff in a minute. But thank you especially for coming on in light of the fact that I had a few quibbles maybe with some of this stuff. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk about it.
So where did you're in Louisville now, but where are you from originally? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Louisiana. In fact, I spent most of my life between in my formative years in between Louisiana and Texas. So I was born in Louisiana in the southwest portion, a little town called DeRidder was where we were living when I was born. And but my earliest memories were actually in Texas because my dad went to seminary at Southwestern Seminary. Ended up not going into ministry. They thought they were going on the mission field, didn't do that. And we stayed in Texas for a few years more. My parents were both school teachers. My dad was a coach. And eventually we made our way back to DeRidder. And that's where I grew up, graduated from high school, and then left there, went to college and in Louisiana. But after college, ended up going back to Texas, to Dallas Theological Seminary. And so I was back in Texas again and spent a bit of time there. And then it eventually came to Louisville for a PhD. Went back to Texas again to teach my first teaching position in Criswell College in Dallas, Texas. And then finally they called me to come back up here to teach at Boyce College back in 2008. We've been here in Louisville since then. But my growing up years were mainly in the South, the deep South.
So you're a lifetime Southern Baptist then?
Pretty much. So I was raised as a Southern Baptist. Before I was born, I was a Southern Baptist, I suppose, because my mom was going to Southern Baptist Church and Sunday school and all the rest. When I was reared, though, in the 1980s when there was an enormous controversy going on in the Southern Baptist Convention between quote unquote moderates and the conservatives, which was really just an old liberal conservative controversy that had played out in the main lines, playing out a little bit later amongst the Southern Baptists. And a lot of the churches that we were aligned with growing up were aligned with the moderate side of that controversy. And even my home church for a period of time that's where they were. So when I went off to seminary, I was really looking for a place that was going to teach me how to study the Bible. I had gone through a transformation in college. I was a professing Christian since I was 9, but when I was in college, I really, through a series of events, the Lord put in my heart, you've got to learn the Bible. You've got to learn theology. Where can I do that? And I heard there was a pastor that was very influential in my life at the time who had gone to Dallas Theological Seminary, and so I ended up there. But the key thing about that was, to answer your question about denominational background, was when I was at Dallas Theological, for that period of time, I was actually thinking, am I going to stay a Southern Baptist? Some of my background had been in moderate churches, and even in the church I went to in college, they were definitively a moderate church, which meant they were on the more progressive, they were aligned with the more progressive end of the people in the Southern Baptist denomination. And I kind of thought that's all there was, and didn't realize the controversy that was going on, because I was just young. I wasn't paying attention to all of that. And I just remember, in fact, a friend of mine saying, you ought to go to Southern Seminary with me after college, and I was like, I'm not going there. Most liberal guy from my church was telling me to go there. I'm not, my home church was telling me I'm not going to go there. So I ended up going to Dallas, and I remember thinking at the time I was considering maybe I should be a Bible church guy. And for a time we attended a Presbyterian church, CA church, and I considered that for a while. But in the end, my convictions were fundamentally Baptist and conservative. And I began to understand that there were a lot of Baptists who held my same point of view about the Bible. While I was in seminary, I found out I wasn't alone. And I was really encouraged to find out there was a person like Albert Mohler in a place like Southern Seminary that was very, very conservative, very much held the same convictions. And that's what led me here eventually to work on a PhD.
Yeah. So Dallas is not a Southern Baptist seminary, right?
No, it's an independent seminary it was one of those institutions that was formed in a reaction to the mainline departures in the early 20th century. So you had a number of schools like that, like Westminster, Dallas Theological Seminary. And so it was one of the traditional inerrantist evangelical schools, but it wasn't aligned with any denomination.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on where all these seminaries stands, but I got this feeling that like Dallas was very aligned with dispensational. Wasn't it like a very dispensational school? That was like the home base of dispensational theology or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. I'm not a dispensationalist, but yes, it was definitely. Yeah. It was definitely that. Kind of loosened up though by the time I got there.
Yeah. How was it that you really felt drawn into essentially ministry or going to seminary, particularly after your dad went to seminary and then didn't go into the ministry?
It really, some events that happened in college really changed things for me. I went through a real crisis of faith when I was an undergraduate. I felt a call to the ministry the summer after my freshman year at a really powerful experience I had on a trip with college students to Glorieta, New Mexico. And we went to this encampment thing called Student Week. And as a result of that, I felt like, man, I'm called to the ministry. Had no clue what that meant. I was completely green, completely theologically unformed. I thought it meant I was going to be a Christian rock and roll drummer. I had no idea what that meant. But what happened over the next couple of years, though, changed all of that. There was two things that happened. One was a particular professor, and one was a friend who had gone off to an Ivy League school. The professor that I had in school was he taught me philosophy and taught political science. He knew the Bible better than anybody I'd ever known. He seemed to really like it as literature, but he didn't believe it. And that came out, in many ways in class. And he would sort of, jibe at the Christian students, but it was a friendly kind of a jibing. But he would come at us, and it really disturbed me because I thought, how can he know the Bible so well and it not have an effect on him? Second thing is I had a friend of mine who went to an Ivy school, and she came back during one of the breaks. We were having a conversation back in our hometown, and she was talking about what she was learning in religion classes about the Bible, and the apostles didn't really write these gospels. It was just all this higher critical stuff that I'd never heard of before. I was just going to a state school and mandatory religion classes, and as we were arguing back and forth, my only real argument I had for her at the time was, I didn't know anything. And so, but it really bothered me that the people who seemed to know the most, the deepest scholars in the world, seemed to not believe that the Bible was anything other than a human book. And so that set me upon a kind of crisis of faith during my sophomore year, after I had felt this call, this, ambiguous call to ministry. I wondered, somebody just yanked the rug out from under my faith. Can I trust the Bible anymore? And there was no particular event that brought me out of this, but I definitely felt it was almost like a depression that I went into. It felt like, is the faith real? Is my faith real? And the Lord just began to build some things back in over the course of my sophomore and junior year. One thing was he brought me into a Bible-believing church that was really helpful. The other thing that happened was when I declared a major in history. I was a music major for a while, and I declared a different major, history, later. The dean said, the dean of the over the department where history was, said to me, I've been taking Greek from this retired Presbyterian minister here in town for about 10 years. And now that you're declaring a history major, you're telling me you want to go into seminary eventually, we could let you get your foreign language credit with this guy. And so that's what I did.
Well, that was great. That's really got to be a big head start on seminary and the languages there.
It was important for academically, but it was important spiritually, because here was this guy who was a scholar. He knew the Greek Bible better than anybody that I had known, and he was going to teach me how to read the Bible in Greek. And I knew that I had to be able to read the Bible in Greek, even as an undergraduate. And so I was very, very motivated, because I wanted to know what this Bible said. I wanted to be able to interact with the scholars who had made such an assault on my faith. C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer, their books had kind of helped me some, but actually being able to read the Greek New Testament was something I felt in my bones I had to be able to do. And this guy came, and for 2 semesters, it was me and one other guy. And then for 2 more semesters, it was just me and the teacher. And then after I got all the hours I could for school, he just had me at his house, and we just read the New Testament together in Greek. And in the midst of that, I learned that you didn't really have to check your brain at the door to become a Christian, that the Bible there was a reasonable apologetic for the scripture and for the faith. And I just had never heard it before in the sort of popular evangelicalism that I was reared in. And so that was an enormous experience for me, where the Lord sort of dug me out of this funk that I'd gotten into. That's a real spiritual funk. But it led to, a fire in my belly to want to learn theology, to learn the languages, and to go as deep as I could. And so I had a kind of parallel thing happening in my own heart during those years. I wanted to preach the Bible, but I also wanted to pursue it academically. And I didn't really know what the Lord was going to do with that. I just pursued both of them and thought that I would see what opportunities the Lord opened up. But I definitely felt a calling towards pastoral ministry. The more and more I got into Scripture, the more and more I learned what the ministry was all about. The ministry is focused on a ministry of the Word, and so that's how I got drawn in eventually to this. And coming and doing a PhD under Tom Schreiner at Southern Seminary helped to solidify things for me, because I actually saw examples of professors who were also pastoring. And one of the things I like about where I'm teaching now, Boyce College is the undergraduate school of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I'm teaching at Boyce College. But so many of my professors when I was at the graduate level were teaching, being a professor at seminary, but they were also doing it. They were in various ways serving in pastoral positions. That's something that was valued here, and it still is. And it's kind of led me to where I am today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask you about that, because my impression is that most people who are in even academic kind of theology, are not pastors, and most pastors don't do kind of that. So you're doing both. How do those jobs sort of relate to each other? Do you feel like you're informed from one to the other as you do them both?
Yeah, I'm sure it probably wouldn't work if it were a university, which is a different setting than a theological seminary, where you're actually training people to do that thing that you yourself are doing. I think that's one of the key differences here. It's a unique situation, because I'm full-time at the seminary, and I'm not giving full-time hours at the church, although I'm one of the preaching pastors at my church. So, something does have to give. It's not like you can have 2 completely full-time jobs. We have other support people who are there to make that work, at the church. Other people do it differently. I've got another friend here who's a full-time pastor, and he teaches adjunctively here at the school. So the balance could go either way, depending on what the church will allow. But there's so much overlap, because especially because my training is in the New Testament. So I'm a biblical scholar. I mean, that's what I do. So I'm teaching the Bible all the time, whether I'm at school or whether I'm at church. That's just what I'm doing. Now, it's obviously different here at school when there's more of an academic cast to things, and there's different there's a difference between that and when you're sermonizing. But there's just definite overlap.
Yeah, this thing you mentioned about finding out that there were these criticisms and denials of the authorship of the scriptures, and that causing sort of a little bit of a crisis of faith. That's one that, again, as I was growing up, no one ever informed me that there were disputes about the authorships of these books. I think about that in my own son as like, man, I want to and I never did any reading in church history too. So I learned the Bible. I knew a lot about the Bible because I grew up in an Assemblies of God church in rural southern Indiana. We knew the Bible, but I didn't know a lot about what people were saying about the Bible or the history of the church. And I think those are things that would be helpful to people to engage with growing up so that they don't get blindsided by some of these things as you get older.
Absolutely. And there's kind of a long tradition within popular evangelicalism of not paying attention to those things. But in some ways, I think that's changing because our culture's changing. It's forcing out a cultural Christianity and forcing the actual Christians to take things more seriously and to form their children more intentionally, because there's not some sort of a cultural support there anymore. So I think that's changing things. I think it's a challenge to us, but I also think that it's a clarifying, refining sort of a thing to the church.
Yeah, I agree. It forces us to kind of get more serious ourselves and dig in a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, definitely.
So, yeah, question. So what is the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood?
CBMW, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. CBMW was formed in 1987. It was spearheaded by John Piper and Wayne Grudem. There were a handful of others who came together in Danvers, Massachusetts to write down a sort of statement of faith, of convictions on what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman, and how that impacts the family and the church. And it's interesting because there was a whole prehistory to all of this, but in the 70s and the 80s especially, you began to see within evangelicalism, and by evangelicalism, I mean that movement that was after the fundamentalist controversies of the early 20th century, but the people who had self-consciously sort of distanced themselves from the fundamentalists, led by a lot of the guys at Fuller Seminary, for example, Carl Henry, that whole tradition of post-fundamentalism and what came to be known as evangelicalism, you began to see a drift, especially in the 70s and the 80s, towards feminist perspectives when it came to the way that men and women related to each other in the home and within the church's ministries. You began to see a growing argument for and practices of ordaining women to pastoral ministry or various ministries, depending on within my church. I'm a Southern Baptist, and the key thing is ordination to pastoral ministry. With other denominations, it's obviously the priesthood and so forth. But you begin to see more and more of this, even within evangelical Protestant traditions. And John Piper and Wayne Grudem were seeing all of this and thought something needed to be done. The precipitating event, interestingly enough, was with Wayne Grudem at ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, met in, I want to say it was like 1980 or something. No, not 1980. I think it was 1985. 86. I think it was 86. They had an entire national meeting on this issue of men and women, and they invited 6 plenary speakers, and they were going to have egalitarians and what we now call complementarianism represented in the plenary sessions, but there's really only one complementarian. It was Wayne Grudem, and then the 5 other plenary speakers were all egalitarians. And so Wayne Grudem knew that representation didn't represent the majority of the ETS, and thought there was a need for an organization to stake their claim, plant their flag theologically, and then to promote that perspective, which seemed to be losing ground within the churches. And so that's when they met in early 1987. They met first in Dallas, Texas. Grudem and Piper, who else? Wayne House, there was a handful of others that met, and then they met later in Danvers, Massachusetts, and finalized this statement of conviction, which came to be called the Danvers Statement. There was no word complementarian then,
Mm-hmm.
but about a year after that, they coined the term complementarian to describe the view that they put in
Mm-hmm.
the Danvers Statement. And so they founded an organization with the Danvers Statement as their doctrinal basis and made it the mission of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood to promote that vision. So it was just an interdenominational Protestant effort to promote what was believed to have been the more traditional view on what the Bible says about these things. And that's how CBMW was formed. It's interesting because at the time, if you ask Grudem and Piper and the other people who were there at the beginning, they felt like they were defining themselves against they had two foils. It wasn't just the egalitarians, which had given a variety of revisionist interpretations of scriptures. They also felt like there were unbiblical stereotypes, unbiblical approaches to masculinity and femininity that may have been very traditional, but were unbiblical.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were trying to push against that as well. It's why they didn't call themselves the patriarchalists or the hierarchalists. They were trying to do something different and trying to show that some of the abuses that were associated with their position, they wanted to distance themselves from that as well. So CBMW got started in 1987 for that, and from that, and for 30 years, it was mainly about promoting the vision of the Danvers Statement. In 2016, though, I became president, and when I was interviewing for the job, I told the board that, listen, that everything has changed in the last 30 years, and we're not just talking about the way men and women function in the church and in the home anymore. Right now, we're being hard pressed on what is a man and what is a woman. And probably even before I came on, so much of the work that CBMW was doing was defining those things that were, topics of conversation within the church and the wider culture about sexuality and gender identity. And so I told the board when I interviewed, I said, we're going to need a new statement that addresses sexuality and gender identity. We're going to have to define what a man and a woman is. We're going to have to plant our flag there. So it's interesting because really some of the more foundational things about manhood and womanhood actually came 30 years later when we did what came to be known as the Nashville Statement. With both the Nashville Statement and the Danvers Statement, what CBMW was trying to do was to provide a resource for churches and for ministries. It was never really conceived of as a culture war group. It was more of a reform group within Christian churches and ministries, and trying to evoke interdenominational interest and commonality so that we could promote this in ministries. So that was the goal of both of those things.
So originally, the theology that you came up with the word complementarian for. Could you just give like a brief outline of what that is for people who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So the word complementarian is deeply rooted in the realities of Genesis 2, where you see that God intends to form a woman who, in the Hebrew, kenegdo, is corresponding to the man. Okay, so a helper who corresponds to the man, and that language kenegdo, corresponding to, that's where the term complementarian is coming from, because it seems to be indicating a complementarity between the sexes. Complementarity means they go together, but they're different. There's a certain amount of equality that they have, but there are also some important differences that are that exist between men and women, and that they're there by divine design. So complementarian is trying to give, in a word, trying to express what Genesis 2 is talking about, that there are important equality, aspects of equality and important differences between men and women. And so the key aspects of equality have to do with the fact that men and women are equally created in the image of God. We all bear the imago Dei. We don't hold to a Bardian view or some, other folks hold to a view where, man and woman, when they're married and they're together in the conjugal bond, that's the full image of God. No, each, male and female equally bear the image of God. And because of that, they equally have worth and dignity. In fact, all of human dignity is rooted in the fact that we're created in the image of God. So you can't talk about one being greater or lesser than the other, because we're all equally created in God's image. And we have infinite value and worth before God because of that. That has implications for the way we think about the benefits of redemption. So men and women are equally redeemed. We equally participate in the benefits of Christ's work for us, in his justifying work, the regenerating work of the Spirit, the sanctifying work of the Spirit. We're all, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3:7, men and women are co-heirs of the grace of life. So we share equally in those things. We've also been given, both male and female have been given the creation mandate. You can look in Genesis 1 where he tells the male and the female, be fruitful and multiply, rule over the earth, have dominion over it, subdue it. That's given to the man and the woman. So there's all these aspects of equality that you see in Scripture just by virtue of the fact that we're created in God's image. But that doesn't erase important differences that God has embedded and encoded into his creation design. And the most obvious one is the physical one, the biological one. Men and women are different biologically. You can't have a be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth without complementarity between the biological realities of a man and a woman. So we would think it's important to say, look, there's the main difference here is a sexual difference. That the difference between male and female fundamentally is how God has ordered our bodies for reproduction. And so that's the difference between male and female biologically. It's how the body is ordered for reproduction. And those differences are obvious. But we would also say that those biological differences imply social differences as well. And in fact, you see those social differences expressed in commands and norms in Scripture. So when God says in Genesis 2, I'm going to make a helper suitable for the man, he's saying that it's going to be like this helper is going to be like the man, but different than the man. This helper is going to have a different role to play socially in the relationship. And of course, in Genesis 2, the issue is one of helping. So the woman is created as a helper for the man. And so in this first marriage, you've got the man who is appointed by God to guard, to lead, and to provide, to lead, to protect, and to provide in the garden. The woman is called alongside of him to be a helper in that vocation, and she has a different role in the procreative process, and then even within the way that the man and the woman relate to one another in the home. The husband is called to lead, and the woman is called to come alongside and support and encourage that leadership. So it's that second part. It's not the equality part that we have, big differences over within our culture or within even intramural evangelical debates. We're not having real debates over whether or not we're equally created in the image of God or share equally in the benefits of redemption. The question is that what are the nature of the differences? And a lot of people don't want to allow any social differences that stem from or obvious biological differences. And so that's where you've seen the debate over the years between complementarians and egalitarians.
So an egalitarian would be what?
Yeah, so I'm giving you long answers.
No, this is good. We've got plenty of time to talk.
Yeah.
And I know most people probably understand what we're talking about, but some people don't. It's like I'm always amazed that like people don't really know what these terms mean sometimes. So that's why I want to cover some of the basic ground first.
So let me boil down the complementarian position to this. Complementarians believe that men and women are created equally in the image of God, have equal value and worth, but they also have important differences. And those differences involve that God has called men to be leaders in their homes. And he's called women to support and affirm that leadership. That leadership within the home has implications for the way that the covenant family is ordered. That would be the church. So that within the church, you would only have qualified men who are the official designated leaders within the church. So that's how you boil down complementarianism. Important equality, important differences of role and function. Egalitarianism would agree with the first half of that, but disagree with the second half. They would say that because we're equally created in the image of God, all the benefits of redemption imply equality in terms of the way that men and women are gifted and their calling within the home and within the church. So egalitarians would hold, yes, there's biological differences between male and female. And yes, there's a kind of complementarity in that sense. But when it comes to leadership within the home and within the church, it's really a jump ball. Whoever is the strongest and the quickest and the most adept can do that, or it's kind of a partnership arrangement. But it's not necessarily designated. Leadership is not designated within the home or within the church based on a calling assigned to a particular sex. They would vigorously dispute that. So you had within evangelicalism, you've got the complementarian position, which is the position I hold, the egalitarian position, which is more friendly to basically a feminist position that you would see in the wider culture. But it's a real difference there. And it's been an intramural debate amongst evangelicals for decades now.
Do you have a sense of what the breakdown of the market share of each of those positions is within the evangelical world?
My sense is that within the evangelical world, some form of the complementarian position is dominant. I think it's highly contested right now in a way that it hasn't been that I'm aware of in my lifetime. But I would argue that institutionally over the last several decades, you've seen complementarianism really take hold. So for instance, 1987, the Danvers Statement is signed. The Danvers Statement is completed. CBMW is formed. You have a number of leaders who are involved in that. J.I. Packer was a part of CBMW at the beginning. He's an Anglican. You had a number of Southern Baptists who were there from the beginning. You have a lot of different PCA folks who were there. And so what's happened in evangelicalism over the last few decades? Well, you had the Southern Baptists, coming towards the end of their conservative liberal squabble, and it settled in favor of the conservatives. And one of the main issues was the role of women within the church's ministry. And you saw Southern Baptists codify a male-only pastorate in 1998, and then they had a statement on the family, I think, in 1998, but then finally revised our entire doctrinal statement, the Baptist Faith and Message, in 2000. And it basically reflects the complementarian position that you see in Danvers. It's a little more specific than Danvers, which it should be because it's a church document, and it needs to be more specific. But it's a complementarian position. You've seen the PCA that was formed, I guess, in the 1970s. They've been, for the most part, complementarian. Now that's a contested position now, I feel like, within the PCA. But within these major groups within evangelicalism, you've seen folks adopt a complementarian position. Some schools, a number of Southern Baptist schools, have Danvers as one of their official doctrinal statements, like the school I teach at. I can name several others. Since 2017, you've had a number of schools adopt the Nashville Statement as well. So you've seen institutions and some churches, adopt these norms as their position. And so I don't have official data on this, but I would say some form of the complementarian position has been dominant, but I feel like it's highly contested right now. And we're waiting to see where this is going to go.
So we have complementarianism and egalitarianism. And then we have the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood that kind of reps the complementarian position. And there's this other organization, is it the Council on Biblical Equality? Is that what it is, that kind of reps the egalitarian position?
Right. It's Christians for Biblical Equality.
Christians for, yeah, I'm not as familiar with them.
Yeah, Christians for Biblical Equality. They were an offshoot of, um, well, like I said a minute ago, back in the 70s and 80s, you really begin to see the egalitarian position take off within evangelicalism. And you saw that formalized in particular groups, I think beginning in the 1970s. Ron Sider had a group called Evangelicals for Social Action. So, and that group gave birth to another group called the Evangelical Women's Caucus. And this was all in 1974, I think, is when they were formed, the Evangelical Women's Caucus. And you had a bunch of evangelicals who came together. They represented the more progressive wing of evangelicalism, but they were arguing for full equality of women in the church's ministry, in society, in the home, everywhere. So you wouldn't have a notion of headship where God had a particular calling on men to lead in certain areas. They were arguing, no, it's completely egalitarian, and that's what the gospel leads us to. And so this Evangelical Women's Caucus, which was formed in the early to mid 70s, they began to have tensions within it. So in that early group, you had a lot of evangelicals, names that you would recognize, but you also had people like Virginia Mollenkott, and folks like that who are now we would recognize as more of like mainline, feminists. But the group split apart. I think it was around 1980 or something, because the Evangelical Women's Caucus took a position which seemed to be affirming of lesbianism. And so there were evangelicals in the group that said, we can't stay here for this. And Catherine Kruger and some others broke off and said, we're going to form our own group. And they partnered initially with John Stott's group. I forgot what they were called. God, Men and Women, or Men, Women, and God. I forgot what it was called, but it was John Stott's group. And then that eventually transformed into Christians for Biblical Equality. And I think Catherine Kruger was the first president. And they set down their statement of principles, which was basically the egalitarian view that I articulated a minute ago. And they formed in 1987 as well. So you had CBMW, CBE, both coming out there in the late 80s.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this, some of this is really before I really became aware of the world. I was in the 80s, I was a teenager, and
Me too.
didn't necessarily have a perspective on some of this. So like, I think the sexual revolution and the counterculture, wasn't just affecting the world; it was also affecting the church.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and some of the stuff that came out of it was actually adopted. You can think of the Jesus movement, kind of came out of the counterculture. Contemporary Christian music, sort of in a sense, came out of it. And then a lot of these, this kind of second wave feminism really did sort of roll over the church, I think, in a powerful way. And I do think that this was sort of the high watermark of that. Right? This is when it was really in the 70s. It was really getting going. And I think when you think about what's happening with the development of some of these things, it is important to keep in mind the context in which it was happening. They weren't just sitting down thinking about this stuff. There sort of was a revolution going on in society at that time, certainly in the 70s, producing some of these currents that kind of roiled the church as well.
No, absolutely. I view the early egalitarians as a kind of baptized version of second wave feminism. And that's really, in my view, what it amounted to. But the way that it came into the church was through revisionist interpretation of Scripture. And so they had a whole program of reinterpreting texts that the church, frankly, hadn't had a lot of dispute upon, over 2,000 years of history. But you begin to see these revisionist interpretations coming into churches, coming into ministries to justify an egalitarian point of view. And so in those early years, what you saw was a lot of debate, a lot of writings going back and forth between scholars, trying to hammer out what are the hard edges of this debate biblically, and where do we stand on these things.
Mm-hmm. So this is the kind of the last bit of history here I want to cover is one of the things that CBMW did kind of early on was create this book called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It's a very thick book. You might have it there.
I brought it.
The blue book, I think they call it, because it had a blue cover originally.
And this is the 90, the one from the 90s.
Yeah, 90.
One that's newer has a little bit different of a blue cover, but this is the original blue cover.
Oh, great. And so it's a big, thick book with a lot of like detailed, you know, debates on passages. There's a lot in it, but this is sort of like you have the Danvers statement, and you've got this big, thick book that sort of is the scholarly. I guess it's the scholarly defense behind the Danvers statement.
Yeah, it was their attempt at the time to answer the revisionist interpretations of key texts on manhood and womanhood. So starting with Genesis, going all the way to the Gospels, and then especially the writings of Paul, trying to say, look, this is what the evangelical feminists are saying, or the egalitarians are saying, and this is why those interpretations aren't plausible, and why you shouldn't let your conscience be captive to that particular point of view. Remember, this was an at first was an intra-evangelical squabble between groups that both were professing to hold to the authority of Scripture, and so the initial appeal was to appeal to Christians' consciences by what does the Scripture really teach on these things. I think the egalitarians staked out they planted their flag in theological no man's land, because egalitarians were ironically offering interpretations that I don't think are as plausible as the way the church had been reading the Bible for 2,000 years. It's ironic because there are a lot of like mainline liberal readings of those contested texts that they would agree with. They would have a lot of the similar interpretations that I would of the traditional text. So when Paul says, the husband is the head of the wife, in 1 Corinthians 11:3, there are a ton of mainline liberal scholars that would say, yeah, that's talking about the husband having authority over the wife. That's what Paul believed. So I would have a lot in common with those mainline liberal scholars who interpret like that. Our only difference is they just think he's wrong. They think Paul is wrong when he says those things, and they just tell you, I think he's right. The egalitarians were trying to say, look, we want to hold the biblical authority, and we can't go the Paul was wrong route. There has to be a way to interpret this in a way that what you thought all was true all these years is actually wrong. The church has just missed it. When Paul's talking about headship in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 or in Ephesians 5, it was never talking about authority, and the church just misunderstood that. Mm-hmm. And so that's where you saw the initial battleground was over what does the Scripture actually teach on these things.
Mm-hmm. So the egalitarians put out their own book about the same time, right? So they put what's their book called? Do you have it? Oh, there it is.
Discovering Biblical Equality, and then the subtitle, it's hard to see here, is Complementarity Without Hierarchy.
Okay.
So they wanted to say, look, we're complementarians too, but there's no hierarchy involved in this. And so they answered in, 2004? So Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood came out in 91, and I think theirs came out in 04.
Mm-hmm. So you had these like kind of two evangelical positions, two organizations, two books, and you're kind of going forward in time. And then somewhere along the way, I don't know where this got established. Within complementarianism, there seemed to develop two distinct positions, what they call thin complementarianism and thick complementarianism. So I'm going to take a stab at this because then I want you to set me straight on what I don't know and give me a little bit of the history on it. Thin complementarianism is sort of what I call biblical minimalism, which is to say, what is yes, we affirm, that only men can be ordained, held an ordained office in the church, but other than these handful or two things in the whole Bible where there's explicit scriptural support that says, only men can do these, everything else is essentially egalitarian. So there's the formulation, a woman can do anything an unordained man can do, for example, other than the requirement to be ordained minister. And, I would kind of associate this with the Tim Keller school a little bit. They've tended to have cultivated. And then there's sort of the thick complementarianism is that it more says, well, there's a more expansive sort of creation order of gender and that there should be more pervasive complementarity of roles throughout society. And I don't think there's a succinct a position on that, but it seems to be. I would associate this more with John Piper, who doesn't, for example, believe women should be in combat in the military. Maybe doesn't believe women should be police officers, things of that nature. Do you think these are this is this like a real distinction? And so like, how did this develop?
Yeah, that's a great question on how did it develop, because it's been sort of gradual. When you look at the Danvers statement, I think the Danvers statement is actually pretty strong on talking about the fact that the difference between men and women goes back to a creation order, which is talking about original design, which is basically a teleological position on male and female differences, and biological differences, and then everything that flows from that socially. I think that's there in part explicitly, and then definitely by implication in Danvers. I don't know, though, that when people claim the term complementarian anymore, for some people, I don't know that they're thinking about Danvers. They're not. I don't know that they're thinking about complementarianism as a theological proposition. They're more addressing it as a sociological phenomenon or an ethos that they've encountered and that they're trying to pull away from. At least that's been my experience with what I would call either ex-complementarians or people who seem to be on their way to being complementarians. They're pulling away from an ethos or a culture that they don't like more than they are a theological proposition, or as a way to denying the theological proposition. So yeah, it was interesting because when I read your essay that you referenced at the beginning of our conversation, we would probably have the same critique, because you seem to be critiquing the thin complementarians in that essay more than you were complementarianism as a theological proposition. And that's the way I read what you were saying. So I think you and I would probably have some of the same critiques, because there does seem to be amongst quote unquote thin complementarians this pulling away from male and female having natural differences that have necessary implications in the way that we relate to one another. First of all, in the home and the church, which the Bible speaks most explicitly to, and then outside of the church, where things are worked out more by implication and necessary consequence. So the thin complementarians are basically saying, look, this is what complementarianism is. The pastorate or ordained ministry is limited to men. Outside of that, we're pretty much egalitarian. And so the phrase that you used was from Kathy Keller's book. Was it Jesus and Gender? I forgot the name of it. But in her book, she basically said that a woman ought to be able to do in her ministry in the church whatever an unordained man can do. And so if you have from time to time unordained men teaching the church in small group Bible studies, in my setting, you can sometimes have unordained guest preachers that preach. So if that's happening, then of course you could have women doing that as well, as long as they're not pastors. The sky's the limit. And so and then even within the way that men and women relate in the home, egalitarian arrangement. Did you ever read that book by Brad Wilcox, Soft Patriarchs and New Men?
No, I know Brad, but I haven't read that one.
He wrote this book. I don't think I've never read the whole thing either, but parts of it. But it was an important book when it came out, because he was making the case that even amongst the gender traditionalists, what we would call complementarians, you could still see influences from the egalitarian wider culture having an impact on the way that they actually ran their homes, the way that they actually ran their ministries. It was pushing towards this minimalist framework.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, yes, you'll have formal ministry cordoned off, but you still have, it's a very soft patriarchy uh, in some way.
You know, James Davison Hunter, I don't know if you ever read Evangelicalism, The Coming Generation by James Davison Hunter. It's an academic book that came out in 1987, actually the same year as the Danvers Statement. And he talked about those three streams of thought you mentioned, the kind of the egalitarian, the traditionalist, and then sort of what became complementarianism. And he sort of, he had in there what you might call the cultural contradictions of complementarianism, where he sort of, I think he sort of said that we're affirming headship, but it's sort of reduced to an administrative technique. His word was an administrative
Yeah.
technicality.
Yeah.
It's not really a living reality, and so I think in some extent there is sort of a divergence in how these things are lived out and what it really means. All the people who might look at these statements and affirm them. There's been some what united people against the egalitarians in 1987. Over time, some of their disagreements have diverged in different trends. I don't know.
Well, I think I would put myself in what you termed the thick complementarian.
Mm-hmm.
Some people call them soft complementarians versus hard complementarians. Some people call it, I prefer the terminology narrow complementarians versus broad complementarians. The narrow complementarians are narrowly focused on ordination and the pastorate, and they apply a principle of a male-only pastorate there. So it's very, very narrow. The broad complementarians are more concerned with what does the Bible's testimony say about all of life? What does it say about all of the church's ministry? What does it say about the home? And I think what's reflected in our point of view, the one from CBMW, is more of a broad complementarian position in this sense. Our affirmation starts off with both Adam and Eve were created in God's image, equal before God as persons and distinct in their manhood and womanhood. Distinctions in masculine and feminine roles are ordained by God as a part of the created order and should find an echo in every human heart. Adam's headship in marriage was established by God before the fall. It was not a result of sin. These are all creational realities that have to, even though they're not all spelled out in the Danvers Statement, they have to have implications that are more thoroughgoing than, okay, the difference between men and women is a woman can't be a pastor. That's not taking account of the creational differences between male and female. If you're boiling down manhood and womanhood to what a woman can't do in church ministry, that's just anemic at the end of the day, and it's not really going to stand. My view is that thin complementarianism is not gonna. I don't know how it can last. To me, it seems like, for me, it seems like a way station to egalitarianism, because once you just say, look, we're going to limit just the pastorate to men, but women and men in ministry can do everything else the same. You've just denatured the command. You do have these explicit biblical prohibitions. 1 Timothy 2:12, I don't allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over men. People will look at that and they'll say, that means a woman can't be a pastor at the very least. But then they sort of denature why that command would be there. The command is not there arbitrarily. It's in the very next verse. It says, for Adam was formed first and then Eve. Meaning there was an order in creation at the very beginning that produces this prohibition that I'm giving you right now. In other words, this norm that's issued in a command is flowing from the way God made the world, right? And I don't think narrow complementarians or the thin complementarians really account for that. It makes the prohibitions seem sort of arbitrary and not well grounded in the reality as the Lord has made it. So I believe complementarianism, Danvers complementarianism, as a theological proposition, is more of a broad complementarian view. We may not all agree how that applies in every single scenario, but it is rooted in an order of creation which defines men and women is fundamentally different in their biological organization and in certain social roles that stem from that.
Now, I titled this discussion on YouTube Complementarianism and its Discontents. And that's because recently there have been some kind of what I would call disputes within complementarianism. I think we laid out historically there was the complementarians on one side and the egalitarians on the other, and they sort of disagreed. There were disagreement with each other. Now there seem to be differences emerging from within the complementarian camp of various sorts. I think there's kind of two basic critiques, one coming out of the left and one coming out of the right. And you were writing about some of these, particularly the leftist, I think what I call leftist critiques in a recent blog post that we referenced at the beginning, which I think is in the show notes. I'll make sure it's in the show notes after this if it's not. Which is sort of this, it's sort of a feminist critique. So there's a number of mostly women who came out of, and maybe some still would say they are within the complementarian tradition, who are making some critiques of it. So there was Beth Allison Barr, who would say she's no longer a complementarian, but she wrote a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. So again, I haven't read it, but that's clearly the title's a reference to the recovering biblical manhood and womanhood. Amy Bird wrote a book called Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So another more explicit play on that. I think she would certainly, she's a conservative Presbyterian and would say that she's still a complementarian of sorts. And then Beth Moore recently made some remarks, not that she rejected complementarianism or being a complementarian, but she's like, it shouldn't be a first order doctrine or these things. So what are what is emerging, why is all this kind of emerging now, and what do you see going on with this?
Yeah, in some ways, I feel the intramural conversation consists of people talking past each other, because a lot of the folks who don't want to be called complementarian anymore, the people who wrote the books that you just mentioned, like Amy Bird, Beth Allison Barr, when they cite the reasons that they don't want to be complementarian anymore, sometimes their dissent has nothing to do with complementarianism as a theological proposition. There's a tremendous amount of ink spilled in Amy Bird's book and other books about the so-called ESS, eternal subordination of the Son doctrine, which is not a part of Danvers. Some complementarians have held to some version of that, sure, yes, but it's not. If you dismantle ESS, you haven't dismantled complementarianism. It's just not essential to the view. But it's like I don't know that they understand that, or at least it doesn't come across in their writings. So there are a number of things I feel sometimes we're talking past one another, and so I don't know what to say about that. But I do think that they are pushing, in some cases, more mainline feminist turf at that point. It seems like Amy Bird doesn't want to go off into the mainline feminist turf. As I read her book, she does not want to be called a complementarian anymore. But neither does she want to be called an egalitarian, as far as I can understand what she's saying. But they definitely are dissenting from certain complementarian distinctives.
What do you think is prompting several people? What is it about now, or kind of what's going on, do you think maybe be prompting some of these reconsiderations?
I think one of the best books that people could read right now to understand the moment we are in is Carl Trueman's book, which, because I just said it now, I'm losing it. What is it? The Making of the Modern Self. What is it?
Yeah, I know the book you're talking about. I can't remember the title either. I actually haven't read it yet.
Just totally left.
But everybody's saying that we should read it. So,
yeah, this is going to kill me if I don't tell you.
No,
this.
we can look up the title.
Yeah. Anyway, I've already read the book, but I can't remember the whole title now. But Trueman is making the case that we're in a particular moment right now when it comes to gender and sexuality issues, and I think he's right about that. So I just a minute ago, I told you that I thought the early egalitarian movement was basically a baptized second wave feminism. That's what it was. I think what we're looking at now in the more modern egalitarians, they're becoming more, in my view, they're becoming more and more a baptized third wave. And the third wave was was more influenced by Judith Butler than by, Gloria Steinem, if you know what I mean. So, in other words, it's much more explicitly postmodernist. It seems to me that it embraces some of the basic tenets of critical theory. So you've divided up the world between those who are marginalized, those who aren't. Therefore, what's moral is to support the marginalized, and what's immoral is to support, inequities of power between these different social groups. And so those different social groups have a number of different axes. You've got differences over sex, differences over gender identity, differences over race, right? And we've in our culture been seeing a lot of differences, an upheaval over race, but this gender identity and sexual difference, those two axes are also a big part of this. And so a lot of the arguments that you see today in these books, they're not as exegetically focused as they used to be. What they are is talking about there's a power inequity, and that the people with the power are trying to keep the women without the power from having the power, and we've got to support marginalized people. And so you're seeing a whole new argument that's coming in to argue for a more egalitarian position that seems to me more downstream from third wave feminism, which I see as a consequence of very engaged with critical theory in general. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is the side of it that I have not studied as much because I haven't read these books, and so but my impression from just the internet is there is less arguing over the proper meaning of the Greek word kephale or whatever, and a lot more arguing like, hey, it's 2021 people, let's get with the program.
Yeah,
this is crazy,
it is.
It's kind of like to use to kind of use a secular kind of mode of discourse there.
Exactly.
The one that I find that I'm more familiar with myself is what you might call the right critique of complementarianism, and there seem to be a number of people now who are essentially adopting what you might call a neo-patriarchalist view, and maybe even embracing the word patriarchy itself. So there's some unlike kind of the feminist critiques, these people typically don't have book deals and things like that. It tends to be more of an internet phenomenon maybe right now with people like Michael Foster or Eric Kahn. And they're basically saying, complementarianism was something of maybe a sellout, a compromise. They decided to compromise with feminism back in the 80s, and now we need to go rectify that. I'm curious. I haven't seen you engage with that. I don't know if you're seeing the same phenomenon or kind of what you think of that.
You're Presbyterian, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder. People ask me about this from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't follow a lot of these guys. In fact, I had to look up some of those names just for this show because I was totally unfamiliar with them. So I think I know broadly who you're talking about. In fact, they don't want to use the term complementarian. I think they would call themselves patriarchalists.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm vaguely familiar with some of those guys. I don't have as much of an acquaintance with them as you do. I think that could be denominationally because it seems like a lot of them are staking out ground amongst Presbyterian and Reformed circles.
I think they are kind of a lot of it's conglomerating around the CREC denomination. If you remember, it's like the denomination Doug Wilson's affiliated with. Although it's not him himself. Wilson would be, I think, more in the I would put him in the more traditional complementarian camp. Although he has his own, beliefs.
So, my take on that is when I hear critiques like this, I want to say, what is it that you're critiquing from complementarianism as a theological proposition? Is there, in other words, is it that you think we've said something wrong, or that you think we've said something we haven't said enough?
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to specify exactly what you're talking about there, because what I'm trying to get people to see is that complementarianism is a theological proposition. Before it became what some people perceive as a subculture or anything like that, it was Danvers. It was this initial design of male and female created in God's image, and that has implications for everything. To me, there's a broad theological framework in all of that if more consistently carried out, I think would be to the good.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think would answer some of those criticisms. So I don't believe that it's the implementation of complementarianism that's the problem, but maybe the failure of people to consistently carry it out. To me, that seems to be more of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at kind of how I look at it, I would certainly say I think some of what the complementarian, I call it the implementation, maybe more than the theology of how things are talked about, don't square with reality in some cases. Like this idea that women are attracted to servant leaders. I just don't agree with that statement. I just don't think that I don't think godliness is sexy to godly people, or that some of these statements that people make. I just don't think that really squares up with kind of the realities of how it works. I think there's also been a
what do you mean by servant leaders?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So I think it's interesting. This is sort of to me, the servant leadership concept is basically, it's a couple of things. One, it is this idea of how that a man is the head of the home. So the man is the head of the home. What does it mean? How is biblically a man supposed to lead in his home? And so that's one, and we can talk about that. And the second one is sort of it's a practical strategy. It's sort of practical strategy for how what a woman wants to have be her husband. What would a godly woman want to have as a godly husband? So you'll see, and so for example, in Tim Keller's marriage book, they talk about, well, all authority is servant authority. Jesus came to serve and not be served. And they'll talk about the foot washing episode, with the disciples, and basically to be the leader of the home means to be the servant of all. And there's usually, sort of with the implication that your job as the head of the home is more to serve your wife and children more than to exercise sort of leadership of command. Then there's also essentially this sort of idea that women are attracted to men who are very emotionally supportive, affirming, on fire for God, conscientious, kind, all of those things. So again, one guy did say, godliness is sexy to godly people. Another guy said, kindness is the greatest aphrodisiac in marriage. There's some of these kind of statements that I think conflate what makes someone a good marriage material, which I think, being godly, conscientious, all this makes me, versus what makes you attractive. That I think, whereas I think that's more driven by things like power and status, confidence and charisma, looks and style, resources like money, etc. I think one way this manifests itself is there's really kind of an unwillingness in some cases. The way that things are talked about, all the blame is sort of put on men in a way. That you have this situation where the man is the head of the home, which means he's responsible for anything that happens in the home. And if anything's go wrong, blame the husband. So I don't know if you ever read the book Date Your Wife by Justin Buzzard, where he has his passage if you want to change the marriage, change the man. The first thing you need to know is you're the problem, okay? It's not your wife, it's not your kid. The problem is you. And so that's a little extreme version, but there is sort of that thing. And so there is a sense, in my last little thing, I don't want to get into the critiques, but because I think it's more style. It's more style than theological substance. I think that is the key. But you look at how John Piper talks about women in the military. I mean, his description of why we have women in the military is essentially that cowardly men have shoved women out to defend them because they don't want to fight. which I would certainly agree that men have been very supportive of women in combat and many other things. But I don't think that's a totally fair portrayal of why we have women in combat. I think that there's women who want to be in combat and that there's a feminist movement for more women in combat and these things. And so I think the way it's talked about is what I call like the baby boomer white knight, defending the honor of women and sort of blaming men for breakdown. And, it's like women initiate 70% of divorces. You'll never hear that in, any of these things. So it's like, I feel like there's some things that like, I think one of the reasons Jordan Peterson has been so successful is that he's willing to say some of these things. He kind of talk about it in a more kind of like realistic way as opposed to a more caricatured way. So that's kind of some of my critiques. If I were going to say that I have it, it's less. It's I don't say go down the Danvers statement. I disagree with Proposition 3 or 4 or anything like that.
Yeah. Man, that was a mouthful there.
Yeah, you don't have to like. Again, I'm not going to ask you to respond to it. I'm just saying I would say it's more of it's as you would say, it's more a reaction. If you're talking about the feminist, it's more a reaction about a specific culture, more so than it is a reaction about theology. That I would certainly agree with.
Well, I would. One thing I would say is I want to give up the concept of servant leadership because some people have dumbed it so far down that all it is service and no leadership. If it's actually servant leadership, if it's actually Ephesians 5, husbands, wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He's the head of the church. And so you've got this pattern of Jesus who we're supposed to be emulating as husbands. And Jesus is the head of the church. And yet you do really see Jesus saying, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So there was real leadership. There was real service. What I think the problem is when you basically neuter the whole concept of leadership and just make it all into service. Actual authority. There's no actual leadership going on. That's where you have a problem. It's not the service part. It's just the absence of the other. And the reason I'm saying this is because Jesus really did say things like, he told his disciples, the kings of the nations lord it over them. But it's not going to be like that with you. It's just not going to be like that. In other words, you're going to have versions of patriarchy that are bona fide disasters out in the world. And there are going to be parts of that you can't embrace because so much of what you see in pagan patriarchies is men using their strength to oppress and to harm women and to harm other people who are underneath them. And Jesus is specifically saying that's not what your strength exists for. Your strength does exist for leadership. It does exist for a certain amount of authority that I'm going to give you, but it doesn't exist so that you can, keep your own counsel and do your, serve your own interests. Your strength, your leadership, your authority is so that you can serve others. And so all I want to say is, I understand that when I mentioned Brad Wilcox a minute ago with soft patriarchs and men, I think he was talking about this. He's talking about the fact that the leadership portion has been neutered in many ways. And so that's not good. But there needs to be both things because it's the servant part that distinguishes us from more pagan patriarchies, which we would definitely not want to be affirming or being a part of. So that's all I'm saying. So
yeah, I'd agree with that. I think I might actually put it slightly differently from my perspective. It's less about service, denying service or saying we shouldn't service and we need it, but the idea of like, what is the service to be provided, and who determines what that, and who decides what that service is, and who decides. So there's a sense in which what is service, because Peter, for example, did not want his feet washed by Christ, but he said, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me. So there was a sense in which that we didn't get to decide how he served us. So I think that one of the issues for me was the ambiguity in service. And there's like many meanings of service, and so I do think service properly so called is certainly part of what we are called to in the broadest sense, which, can involve, which can involve helping your wife and kids do things. So I'm not opposed to that either. So I don't want to I don't want to toss the entire concept either. I think, if it's properly understood, I would be in agreement with everything you said there.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I just wouldn't want to lose that
Yeah.
that concept. But I do understand what you're saying on some of the other things. I can't remember the whole string of it.
Yeah. Well, it's like it doesn't matter. But I think for me it was like there was sort of a culture. I think there's like a cultural issue that I associate very much with baby boomers and that kind of thinking. And so now there's I think younger generations don't resonate with things in the same way. So if you look at like the people who are like, again, following a Jordan Peterson or a Joe Rogan, it tends to be younger guys. Younger guys are gravitating to a different style of leadership and different style of, rhetoric. I think, which is, it's worth thinking about. For me, it's like, well, why are all these people turning to Jordan Peterson and not to their pastor? And so that's one that I think about a lot. Just a couple other things. Have you ever read the book Man and Woman in Christ by Stephen B. Clark? Yeah.
Oh, I have never read through the whole thing. I have the book, a part of it, but I've never read it straight through. That's a long one.
Yeah, it's a long one too. And I think it's interesting because Al Mohler said this is basically the book that made him a complementarianism. It was written in 1980, and I was just curious if you had a take on it because it was written by someone who's Catholic, and so I understand that that's out of the orbit. It's a little bit out of the probably mental orbit of what people are doing, huh?
Charismatic Catholic.
Yeah, charismatic Catholic. He was part of a charismatic intentional community and things of that nature. Every time I hear about Amy Barrett or whatever her name is in People of Praise, I'm thinking about Stephen B. Clark in a community. I think it was very kind of related to that even. I'm curious why that book seemed to have not played a significant role in the formation of complementarianism, or it doesn't seem to be referenced as much, given that it was really a very substantive work that's in line with it, written kind of right before it hit.
I think it needs to be. I think it's really important because one of the strengths of it is that he's basically not just arguing from Scripture for his position, but also trying to root things in nature again. Is what honestly complementarians need to do. We need to recover natural law and divine design and how that fits together with explicit commands and prohibitions of Scripture, so that people can understand that we're not what the Bible is saying when it gives a prohibition or a command about manhood and womanhood. You don't want to think that thing is just totally disconnected from nature. And it seems to me in the parts I'm familiar with from the book that he is trying to bring those together. I don't know why it didn't have more of an influence because when was it written? Like 1980, right?
It was published in 1980. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 1980. So I don't know why. It may have been because he was a Roman Catholic and complementarianism was an explicitly Protestant movement. I know that book was shaping it was more than just Al Mohler. A lot of people were helped by that book because for the longest time it was about the only thing there was.
Right.
When you had this second wave feminism being baptized into egalitarianism, there wasn't much else to turn to at the time. And until CBMW came along and you started to see a proliferation of resources, that's what people were using. It may have been just that it was displaced by, things like this and, other books like this,
Right.
The Women in the Church book that Schreiner and Kostenberger edited, which were serious, exegetical works and very scholarly done. But I don't know why. I can't account for it. I am glad to hear that I think it's going to be reissued.
It's going to be reissued, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the prices of it have actually gotten quite high for used books.
They're rare.
They're harder to find now than they used to be when I got my copy.
When I bought one a year or two ago, and when I got it, I want to say I paid like $80 or $90 for this used copy of it, which was just a testament to the fact that people still want it, but you can't find it.
Yeah, so it is going to hopefully be it's being reissued. It's coming out soon.
I think Moeller may have wrote a preface for it.
Yeah, I don't know who's doing that. But yeah, it is interesting that he specifically cited that book and this kind of famous story about how he changed his mind on gender
Oh yeah.
thing. How do what do you know that with all these like debates and these books kind of percolating out there? How do you kind of see things playing out in the future? Do you see how do you see these trends playing out a little bit?
I do think that people are going to have to either be all the way complementarian or not. I don't think there's going to be a middle space for much longer. And if I plotted things out right now, I'd say you've got your amongst those who profess to be Christian, you've got your sort of mainline feminists, right, who don't hold to biblical authority, but they do they use the Bible in some way, but they hold to an egalitarian framework. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
After that, you've got the egalitarians who want to hold to biblical authority, but at the same time they want to hold to egalitarian interpretations. Just to the right of that, you've got these sort of minimalist complementarians, the thin complementarians, who want to hold to biblical authority, but they want to hold to almost all of egalitarianism except for the pastorate.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got your normal complementarians who want the whole package. They see the differences in nature. They see God's design not only demonstrated in what we see in nature, but also clearly written on the pages of Scripture, and they want to see the whole package. I just don't know how you're going to, as the culture secularizes and as it becomes harder and harder to become a Christian, I don't know how those two middle ground positions could stay. It seems like you're going to have to take the fulsomeness of biblical revelation or not. And you're going to have to understand nature as having an intrinsic design to it or not. Because these middle positions they seem to me like a no man's land at the end of the day. And it's not going to command the attention of men. It's not. So it's going to have to be all the way one or the other. So I don't know when that's going to happen or how that's going to happen. And it might involve the more fulsome complementarian position becoming a marginalized, no status position in our society. But you'll have to be all the way there or all the way in the other place, because I don't see how the current push towards wokeness is not going to allow the middle positions. You're just going to have to pick one way or the other. So that's kind of where I'm viewing things right now. But we'll see where it goes, and we'll see how long it takes.
I think you're right that kind of this middle ground is sort of dissolving, and I think there was always this appeal, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, just trying to win some appeal to the middle and trying to win people over by making this most winsome appeal. And now I think that those sort of like, just like the kind of the moderation in politics has kind of gone away, and we're becoming more extreme on politics. It's sort of like there's kind of a more of a separation going, less appeal to the middle, and I think that's one reason some people are like using terms like patriarchy again. I think part of it is like we don't have to. We're marginalized. We might as well just embrace the marginalization, And I don't think it's necessary to embrace marginalization, but you never know what's going to happen. But I do agree. It's like some of these middle positions are probably they don't. That was sort of I think one of the take of my piece you're responding to is I don't see how this lasts. For all that much longer. It might last longer than I think it will. A lot of times, I'm always surprised how long we think, this is going to end here pretty soon. But it often seems to, sometimes they go on longer than we think, but that seems to be the trend to me. And then I do think, again, some of these divisions, even within the complementarian camp, it's just like political conservatism or the Democrats. These old coalitions are sort of breaking up. There's some changes, some refactoring going on and things, and it's probably affecting some of the religious thinking as well, particularly with generational change.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. What do you have any particular things with CBMW that's coming up or that you'd like to tout or anything you want to promote? I didn't mention The website is cbmw.org, and I know you have a blog on there with a lot of stuff. Is there anything you want to highlight?
Yeah, just to tell people, look, you can visit cbmw.org. The latest edition, which is 2020 or 2021 of this book, is posted there for free, the entire PDF. You can download it, read it. We have so many resources on that website that you can come and visit. We're writing about issues as they become relevant. We're not trying to chase the news every day, but we do essays on the blog and try to stay engaged with the issue theologically. So I would just tell people, please visit cbmw.org and consider, if you care about this issue, consider supporting what we're trying to do. Read our confessional statements, read the Denver statement, read the Nashville statement, and look at the work we're trying to do. And if you feel like this is something you could contribute to, please do so. The donate button's right there on the website. We've been kind of shut down from doing events because of COVID, but I'm anticipating in the summer and especially afterward that we're going to be opening back up. So usually throughout the year, I'm traveling and doing events at other places, and that's been kind of shut down for a while. But we're hopefully to get that back rolling. One other thing I would mention is we have a theological journal that's called Icon. And there's a print version of that, but there's a free version that's available for download on our website. And we review books in there. We take on, some pretty hard issues in that journal. So I invite you to read Icon as well.
Well, I should also mention Carl Trueman's book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
There it is.
So I looked that one up for you. And again, if you have not already, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, do that and visit themasculinist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Denny Burk, president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, thank you so much for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me, Aaron. It was a real pleasure.